In 2013, a woman in a small town in Kazakhstan walked out of her house on an ordinary morning and did not make it to the end of her street. She did not trip. She was not ill, at least not in any way she could feel. She simply stopped, sat down on the ground, and fell asleep. Her neighbors found her there. They could not wake her. She slept for 2 days. When she finally opened her eyes, she did not know where she was. She did not recognize the people around her. She reported seeing horses that were not there, and felt certain, with complete conviction, that something enormous and invisible had been sitting on her chest the entire time she was unconscious. This was not a medical emergency in the conventional sense. There was no fever, no seizure, no detectable injury. Her brain scans showed nothing. Her blood work came back unremarkable, and she was not the first. She was not even close to the first. By the time this particular woman fell asleep on her street, more than 60 residents of the town of Kalachi had already experienced the same thing, and nobody, not the doctors, not the government investigators, not the international researchers who eventually arrived, could explain why. Kalachi is a small settlement in northern Kazakhstan, a former Soviet mining town with a population that by 2010 had shrunk to a few hundred people. It sits on flat steppe land, surrounded by nothing in particular, far from any major city. There is nothing about the place that would suggest it as the site of one of the strangest and most thoroughly documented medical mysteries of the 21st century. And yet, between 2010 and 2015, more than 120 residents of Kalachi fell victim to what local people began calling the sleeping sickness. The episodes came without warning. A person would be going about their normal day, working, eating, walking, and then they would simply lose consciousness. Not faint in the way a person faints from low blood pressure, dropping suddenly and waking in seconds. They would go down slowly, deeply, and stay down for hours, for days. Some slept for 6 days without waking. During that time, they could not be roused by any normal means. Loud sounds did not wake them. Shaking did not wake them. Light did not wake them. They breathed. Their hearts beat. But they were, for all practical purposes, unreachable. The symptoms that appeared when people woke were consistent enough to be their own catalog of horror. Nearly every affected resident reported hallucinations, not vague impressions or dream fragments, but fully formed, visually coherent experiences that felt in force the moment, completely real. A man reported that his house had filled with horses. A woman said she watched snakes crawling across her ceiling for what felt like hours before she understood she was waking up. Several residents described encounters with angels. One man, who experienced multiple episodes, said he saw the same figure in a long coat standing at the foot of his bed each time, watching him, never speaking. Children who were affected woke up screaming. A number of adults woke up and immediately tried to undress and run outside, for reasons they could not afterward explain. Memory loss accompanied many episodes. People woke without knowing what year it was. Some did not recognize their spouses. The disorientation could last for days after consciousness returned, and the episodes recurred. The same people fell asleep again and again. Some residents experienced 4 or 5 separate episodes across the 5 years the sickness persisted. The town began to empty. Families who could leave left. The investigation that followed produced a sequence of hypotheses that were each compelling and each wrong. The first assumption was radiation. The Soviet Union had operated a uranium mine near Kalachi, and the mine had been abandoned after the collapse of the USSR, left sealed but unmonitored for decades. The proximity was suspicious. Radiation poisoning was tested extensively. The results were negative. Radiation levels in the town were within normal ranges. The mine was not leaking detectable radiation into the inhabited areas. Investigators moved on. The second hypothesis was a virus or bacterial infection, a pathogen of unknown type that was somehow affecting the brainstem or the neural systems governing consciousness. Extensive testing found nothing. The affected residents did not share a single identifiable infectious agent. The disease, whatever it was not spreading person to person. The way an infection spreads. The third hypothesis was the one that received the most public attention and the least scientific support. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria. The argument was that the social stress of living in a declining post-Soviet settlement, combined with the anxiety generated by the early episodes, had produced a contagion of psychosomatic symptoms. People were falling asleep because they believed they would fall asleep. The affected residents found this explanation insulting. The investigators who proposed it found it increasingly difficult to sustain when children who had no knowledge of other cases began experiencing episodes, and when the pattern of outbreaks continued to correlate with specific weather conditions rather than with social proximity to previous cases. That last observation, the correlation with weather, was what eventually broke the case open. Researchers noticed that episodes clustered on specific days. Days when the wind came from a particular direction. Days when temperature inversions trapped air close to the ground. Days when, in other words, whatever was in the air would have been concentrated rather than dispersed. This pointed away from everything biological and towards something chemical. The abandoned uranium mine was re-examined, this time not for radiation but for gas. What investigators found inside the mine's shaft and in the surrounding soil changed the entire picture. The uranium extraction process had left behind large quantities of decaying organic material in the mine tunnels. As that material continued to decompose, it produced carbon monoxide and various hydrocarbon gases. Under normal conditions, these gases dispersed harmlessly into the atmosphere. But under specific meteorological conditions, particularly when atmospheric pressure dropped and temperature inversions occurred, the gases rose through the soil and concentrated at ground level in the inhabited areas of the town. The residents of Kalachi were being intermittently poisoned by invisible gases seeping up from the ground beneath their feet, not enough to kill them, enough to interrupt the neural processes that maintain consciousness. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin with a much higher affinity than oxygen, effectively starving the brain of the oxygen it needs to stay awake and aware. At low concentrations, the effect is not death, but something neurologically stranger. The brain does not shut down cleanly. It distorts. It produces the hallucinations. It generates the dream states. It maintains the body's basic functions while disconnecting the systems responsible for awareness and voluntary action. The sleeping sickness of Kalachi was not a virus, not radiation, not hysteria. It was the brain running on the wrong gas, doing its best to keep the lights on while the fuel it was designed to run on was slowly being replaced by something it had no way to process. The town was evacuated and demolished between 2015 and 2016. The residents were relocated to a nearby city. The buildings were torn down. The mine was sealed more thoroughly. And the sleeping sickness stopped. There have been no new cases since the evacuation. The mystery had an answer, and the answer was, in its way, clean. Identifiable cause, identifiable mechanism, identifiable solution. But the answer does not fully close the door on what the case revealed about the nature of consciousness and how little separates the state you are in right now from the state those residents fell into without warning. Carbon monoxide has no smell. It has no color. It produces no sensation of entering the body. The residents of Kalachi did not feel themselves being poisoned. They felt fine, completely fine, right up until the moment they were not. The woman who sat down on her street in 2013 had no warning. The man who saw the figure in the long coat at the foot of his bed had no warning. The children who woke up screaming had no warning, because the thing that was changing their consciousness was the same thing they were using to breathe, arriving through the same channel, indistinguishable from the air that kept them alive until, on certain days. At certain concentrations, it was not. Your brain requires oxygen with a consistency that has no margin for error. Not mostly oxygen. Not approximately the right balance. The precise mixture within narrow tolerances, continuously without interruption. Alter that mixture slightly and the first thing to go is not your heartbeat or your breathing or your digestion. The first thing to go is the part of you that knows it is awake. The part that constructs the boundary between what is real and what the brain is generating from inside. The part that makes you you in any meaningful sense of the word. The residents of Kalachi lost that part first and kept everything else. Their hearts kept beating, their lungs kept working. But the person who had been running the body stepped away, replaced by something that saw horses and angels and figures in long coats standing at the foot of the bed. Consciousness is not a robust feature of the human system. It is a precise and fragile one, maintained by conditions so specific that an invisible gas seeping up through soil in a remote Kazakh town can suspend it entirely without leaving a mark. The woman woke up not knowing where she was. She had been somewhere, clearly. She had seen things, whatever state she had been in. For those 2 days, it had been real enough to leave memories she could not explain. The line between that state and this one is thinner than most people ever have occasion to think about. It is a line drawn in oxygen, maintained breath by breath, and it holds until it does not.